So welcome everybody. We're just firing up this online seminar, which launches the 9th annual Christ College Climate Seminar. I will just leave it a few moments before I start because it takes a while for people to join and their connections to fire up. And very soon I will set the scene and then introduce our chair for this evening. It's very nice. We've had a wonderful response to this evening's seminar. It's very nice to be joined by so many friends and so many new friends, old friends and new friends of this Christ's College Climate Seminar series. I think I will start now, and I know that connections are still firing up and people are still joining, but I will start now and get the show on the road, and the real content will start in a few minutes once I hand over to our chair. So first of all, I would like to welcome you. I'm Rob Doubleday. I'm the Director of the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge and also a Bi-Fellow at Christ College. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this, as I said, the 9th annual Christ College Climate Seminar series. These series began in 2014, and the intellectual motivation and driving force for these seminars is a great friend of the college and the university, Charlie Kennel. Professor Kennel gave the first series, the title of which was Avoiding the Unmanageable and Managing the Unavoidable, What to Expect from Climate in the Coming Decades and What We Might Do. Charlie Kennel was an astrophysicist at California. He then in the mid-90s became an associate administrator at NASA and was the director for the mission to Planet Earth, the largest Earth science program of the time. And that led to Charlie's continued interest in Earth as a system and climate change in particular. From NASA, he went on to be the director of the Scripps Oceanography Institution and has continued since then his link with Christ College. And I just wanted to credit Charlie with his support for this series. Now, a few things on housekeeping. We are recording this seminar and the recording will be put online. So it's a public forum. Please do put your questions in the Q&A function. And comments, you're welcome to put comments in the chat. But questions in the Q&A if you want those questions to be addressed. The idea is that this will be a dialogue, a conversation, which is being chaired by my friend and colleague, Emily Farnworth. I will just briefly introduce Emily to you and then I will hand over. So Emily Farnworth is the director of the still quite new Centre for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall in Cambridge. And together with Emily Shuckburgh and myself, she co-convenes the Cambridge Zero Policy Forum, which aims to bring together an interdisciplinary conversation on climate change and public policy. Previously, Emily was leading climate initiatives at the World Economic Forum. So, Emily, we're very grateful that you're chairing this evening's seminar, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Really a great joy to be here and a privilege to be here with my two panelists. So it's great to have Dr. Emily Shuckburgh, who heads up Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge, as well as being an eminent scientist and getting all sorts of leadership around the topics in the computing science world as well. So we're going to hear from Emily first in this conversation. Also wonderful to have Michael Liebreich with us, who's CEO of Liebreich Associates, but again, a huge guru really in the finance and finance and energy space in particular. So really excited to get his views and thoughts today. We're going to kick off with some thoughts from Emily, and then I'll turn to Michael, and then we'll have a conversation about really thinking through what is happening in the world at the moment, particularly kind of on the back of COP26 late last year. And in particular, looking at the sort of 2030, 2050 time horizons, because we all know there's an awful lot that needs to happen in the short term, but there's also a lot of planning that needs to happen so that we can deliver what we need in the longer term. So it'll be interesting to sort of get the perspectives on those two different timelines. So Emily, maybe I can pass over to you first, just to give us a bit of insight from your perspective on COP26.
Thank you very much, Emily. And yeah, so what I've been asked to do is just to summarize it, I guess in a way, just to take people's minds back to the end of last year and COP26 to remember, what some of the key outcomes from Glasgow were. I mean, of course, actually, one of the big successes of Glasgow was that it happened at all, which, in September with the COVID situation wasn't at all obvious that it was actually going to be able to get that number of people in the same place in a safe way. And so, even that was a success. The key thing that came out of Glasgow was the Glasgow Climate Pact. One thing from my perspective as a scientist, certainly my reading of the Glasgow Climate Pact, it struck me quite how front and center actually science was compared to previous such agreements. So the text starts off with a discussion of I think the text says alarm and utmost concern about the climate impacts that are already occurring around the world. And it also was much stronger than the Paris Agreement in terms of defining what is required in terms of emissions reductions to prevent the worst of further impacts. And so the text clearly talks about what is needed to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees of warming in terms of 45% reduction in emissions by compared to 2010 by 2030, and then net zero by the middle of the century. And I think actually that text, again, 1.5 was a number that I think took a lot of people by surprise in many ways in its inclusion in the Paris Agreement, and the fact that it was a number that was, in the intervening years has become much more focus on, not least because of the IPCC special report, which itself was an outcome of the Paris Agreement. But the fact that 1.5 was so clearly in the Glasgow Climate Pact was obviously important. So what do we have in Glasgow? We had 197 countries come together to agree more ambitious climate action than had previously been agreed to. Alok Sharma gave a speech on Monday, his first major speech post Glasgow, where he was reflecting on what had happened. He kept on stressing in that speech how he thought there'd been the successes he saw of Glasgow had come about through what he saw as being a recognition of collective self-interest. And that phrase collective self-interest was one he repeated time and time again throughout his speech. Now, aside from the pact itself, a key aspect of Glasgow was, of course, country commitments, country pledges. And so, we did see significant increased pledges from many countries. A number of them particularly stand out. Some of them in advance, China had come forward sometime in advance with its carbon neutrality by 2060 pledge. India during Glasgow itself, net zero by 2070. Of course, the key question is the extent to which those pledges together put us on a trajectory that is consistent with 1.5, and it's clear that they don't even come close to doing so. So there've been various assessments of what exactly, if you take to get, there are all sorts of assumptions you have to make as to exactly what all the pledges mean and whether or not they would be fully realized or not. But it's clear that current policies are nowhere near enough to turn the dial in the way that's necessary. Even the most optimistic interpretations of the pledges are still not enough to put us on a 1.5 trajectory. They may be getting in the zone of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees if we take those most optimistic interpretations. But consequently, one of the most important aspects that was really central to the negotiations was the agreement to come back in a year's time with enhanced pledges. One of the key things that the UK presidency had driven forward as part of its diplomacy and as part of its strategy around Glasgow was to almost have a parallel track of activities that were focused around a smaller number of countries and particular sectors. And so we saw additionally in Glasgow various different sector-based emphasis on coal or on cars. You know, there was this famous cash, cars and trees, or whatever the phrase that kept on coming out of Allegra Stratton. And I think, you know, that was obviously part of an overall strategy of starting to move towards, you know, away from ambition, which in a sense was what characterized the Paris Agreement and things in Paris, to the next stage, which is action. And that action does have to happen at a sector level. So in the sense, you know, I feel that that was an important part of the, you know, an overall evolution of the global political process. There are a few other standout things. I mean, you know, there's famously, it was the first time coal has ever been mentioned in one of these texts, which was obviously a significant advance. And, you know, if you want to say that in some sense it's marked the end of the fossil fuel era and the start of a new era, then, you know, perhaps that's an important milestone. Obviously, there was a big saga at the end about whether or not there was the words phase down or phase out of coal in the final text, and some political shenanigans associated with that. But, you know, in a way now, the key focus is what comes next and how the rest of the UK presidency year is used and what happens in the run up to COP27. There are still some big things on the table, still a lot on adaptation, on loss and damage. These are going to be big topics that are going to be you know, discussed over the rest of this year and into COP27. The famous $100 billion on international climate finance for developing countries is still an ongoing saga, but, you know, maybe that can be completed finally, even if late. This year. So there's you know, it feels like this is a sort of an ever-evolving story, of which Glasgow was yet another milestone as part of that story, but one that is at least ratcheting in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really helpful summary, and just useful to sort of hear the sort of particular insights that you felt relevant to pull out, and really sets the scene, really. So I'm going to turn to Michael now. And Michael, it would be great to get your reflections of what all this means for the real economy. I mean, what's your perspective on all of this?
Thank you very much. And it's great honor and pleasure to be here. Sadly, there may not be much controversy between what Emily has just given us her summary and the summary that I would give. I might be even more sort of shaded towards the fact that COP26 did deliver very substantial progress. I actually think that it was a very, very good COP and moved us a long way forward. Of course, not if you think that the role of COP is to lock the world in some enforceable way to 1.5 degrees. But, you know, surely we've realized now with the process of COPs over the last 26 of them, that isn't realistic. That isn't the way it works. And we should have realized that with Copenhagen. Copenhagen was very much in 2009, was very much set up as one negotiation followed by 50 years of implementation. You know, one huge argument about who gets what carbon budget, and then we would implement for the rest of time. And that just utterly failed. With top down, there was the whole thing about, you know, we need an agreement that is enforceable and fair. Enforceable in what way? What power does the UNFCCC really have? And so then we moved in Paris to the process whereby there are nationally determined contributions, i.e. voluntary contributions, and then these processes of ratcheting and the process of verification and so on. So for me, what we saw in Glasgow was supposed to be 5 years after Paris, ended up, of course, because of COVID being 6, was the first real test of that Paris framework. And it passed with unbelievable flying colors. So what you saw was, first of all, the process brought the US back to the table. It brought pledges out of China, out of India, out of Saudi Arabia, extraordinary stuff. I mean, now, of course, only pledges, but, you know, what I think we need to understand is that there's a process now for a country to go from politicians' pledge, which you could say is just blah, blah, to the nationally determined contribution, which is blah, blah on paper that gets very much more difficult to resolve from, followed by domestic legislation, and followed by the real economy doing stuff. And in fact, it's not followed by, in fact, very often the real economy precedes those negotiated positions, because what we also saw, if you take that long arc of history, in Copenhagen, there was no cheap solar, there was no cheap wind, we didn't know what we could do. And the politicians are never going to put a gun to their heads saying that they're going to deliver reductions that they don't know how they can, they're going to make commitments that they don't know how they can live up to. So you've got this dance between the real economy delivering innovation, financing, scale, and then the politicians will commit, and that then gives the signals for the real economy and the investment community to put money to work. And that's how it works. And it's working. It is actually working. So does it get you all the way in one go? No. So what we saw, though, is actually even going into COVID 2019, I wrote a piece saying peak emissions are closer than you think. And here's why. Because what you actually saw was the emissions intensity of the global economy falling so substantially that we are clearly in a period of almost peak emissions. Of course, that's not net zero. I get it, okay? But now we've got, okay, we're coming out of the pandemic and we're seeing the bounce back, but, and it's, the headlines are all, oh, emissions bounce back 6%. Well, yes, but they dropped by the same amount the year before. So what we've actually got is a period since about 2013 or 14, where the global economy has grown by a quarter and emissions have grown by only 2 or 3%. And that is as near as, damn it, decoupling. And that was going into COP, that was going into all of these pledges, going into a better set of NDCs, et cetera, et cetera. So now the pledges would get us to 1.8 degrees. That's the kind of consensus. And of course, Emily's much better at me, talking about the error bars, which are very substantial. The pledges 1.8, the nationally determined contributions 2.4, right? So not by any means enough. These are catastrophic outcomes. These 2.4 certainly would be. But look at it in the perspective, from the perspective of where we were, around the time of Paris, it was 3.1 degrees with an actual outside chance that it could have been 5 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, civilizational ending type levels of warming. So, the arc is being bent. And so that then raises the question of what has to happen now, and are we well positioned for that arc to bend further? And there's a real question, I think, for those who are, committed, those working on climate action. What is better, a set of sort of pledges and grand statements that would get us to 1.5, or more work now, in a sense, later in that value chain? Take the pledges we've got and turn them into NDCs and into then domestic policy at the national level, municipal level, cities, etc., and feeding back through finance and into the real economy. And of course, the answer is we should be able to walk and chew gum, and we need to do both. But I do think when you get people, like Greta Thunberg and all these sort of Extinction Rebellion types saying it was a complete failure because it doesn't deliver, wrapped up and tied with a nice bow, all of a legally enforceable, pathway to 1.5. I mean, it's not, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to, what can I say? I think that's sort of misunderstands how change happens in the real world. And it's fine. It's not critical because that's their job to do that. But I'm much more interested in the whole sausage machine of how we get real assets in the ground. Now, on that, what we've seen is for quite a few years, investment in clean energy had actually stalled. And there's some figures out from Bloomberg NEF, the team that I founded, I think it came out today, showing that actually now those numbers are starting to soar again. And they're soaring not because of renewable energy or clean energy, but actually now because of transportation. So you're now getting the afterburners of transport kicking in. So electricity, we get clear line of sight to clean it up. Transport is now kicking in. And now the focus goes to, industry, to heating and industry. and then difficult bits of transport like aviation, which get an enormous amount of coverage, and everybody's very, excited about Flugscham and all that sort of stuff, but they are actually only a couple of percent, each. And so, in the grand scheme of things, we've got to do them, but I'd much rather see solutions to, the big chunks, the steel manufacturing, the cement, the long distance freight, the private cars, those sorts of things within transport and industry. So we need to do everything. We all know that. So I'm actually very optimistic. One thing I would say is we've got to see where we are at this point in time. We've also got an enormous price spike, which we're all learning a huge amount from, unpleasant lessons. At one level, this is purely a gas problem, right? And those investment figures, I said that clean energy, the investment hadn't increased. It got to about $700 billion in about 2011 and stayed largely flat. Investment in fossil fuels, right across the value chain, upstream, midstream, downstream, was around 1.2 trillion in 2014 and has dropped to 700 billion. So you add the two together, energy investment has gone from 1.9 trillion to 1.4 trillion. So 500 billion a year has disappeared, and it's all fossil. And, it's great to celebrate that. And there are people very happy that, Shell has been smacked around by the Dutch courts, and it's now much harder to invest in fossil, and all of the multilateral banks are prohibited essentially by now new codes of conduct from investing in fossil, et cetera, et cetera. But we've actually got massive underinvestment in the energy system and a price spike. And it is not just, because the people that suffer from that price spike, it's not me sitting in my big house in Notting Hill Gate. It's going to be people who are struggling to get to work, fill the car, keep their homes warm, probably using gas, etc. And I think that we've got to get we've got to get much more nuance into the conversation about the transition. There's a clue in the word. It's a transition. It is not stop doing X and only do Y, with Y, by the way, not having the supply chains, not having the planning permissions yet, etc., and taking a few decades to roll through. But we are, at the moment, demonizing one thing before we've got the second thing built. And the people suffering are the poor of the world, the developing countries, and the less well off in our own societies. So I think we need to be much more careful. And I have a podcast for those who've discovered it, and I had a leading investor in African infrastructure, and I asked him what he wants to see out of COP26, and he said, Michael, let us invest in gas in Africa. You're keeping the lights on with gas, and you're not allowing us to invest and not helping us to invest in our own gas. You want us to be purer than you are. Now, if we want Africa, India, the big developing countries to leapfrog, then we've got to help them to do that. We can't just say, well, we're not going to fund that, and we're happy to do these little bits. And we need to just close with the keeping things in perspective. Renewable energy, mostly electricity. Electricity is only 20% of final energy globally, and renewable electricity, fantastic from a standing start, is now about 14 or 15% of that. But 15% of 20% is 3%, right, for modern renewables. And we cannot keep ignoring the 97% or just pretending it's not going to be a major problem and it'll all go renewable in some accelerated time frame. It's much more complex than that. Just, I suppose, sorry, and finance, I can come back perhaps in the Q&A and talk more about the finance, how the financial sector is doing. There's some delusional stuff going on. There's some very good work going on. And we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. Yeah,
I just have one quick follow-up question, and then I'll come back to Emily to sort of react as well. But you mentioned this point around, when we were kind of, in the Copenhagen era, or heading into that COP, the actual kind of cost of some of the solutions was much, much higher. Now we're seeing obviously kind of costs coming down, particularly of renewables, but as you point out, it's only part of the, part of the solution anyway. What's your sense as to whether or not we've already got enough affordable solutions across the whole economy, or how do we need to, what levers do we still need to sort of continue that acceleration of investment into the areas that are required?
So we clearly do not have all the technologies that we need. And it's very easy to get into these kind of tribal discussions that say solar is cheaper than coal. It's like, well, not if you're trying to keep the lights on at night. It isn't, or it might not be, because you need long duration storage. We need a resilient system. We need lots and lots of investment in the system-wide investment. So, just arguing that your favorite bit of the complex system, is good, and therefore you can ignore the rest. That's kind of what I'm saying. Do we have all the technologies? No, we don't. We don't have, even things like, the high voltage DC, which is going to play a part. We don't have all of the technologies for very high voltage subsea cables, just in terms of repeaters and in terms of how you repair them and so on. Now, these are fantastic investment opportunities, but you can't say, well, you got off the shelf, go to, we don't even make enough, by the way, high voltage DC cable for all the things that we want to do. Investment, and there's a whole area which is hugely painful or hugely difficult, which is the minerals, because you can absolutely imagine 2050, a high performing, affordable, beautifully clean, low air pollution, clean energy and transportation system that, we could sketch it out. Great. But it's going to involve a lot of steel, a lot of copper, a lot of nickel, a lot of cobalt, and a lot of lithium, and the supply chains there do not yet exist. We need to develop those and invest them. And maybe lithium, we may need to have to take out of brine. And then there's an example of a technology which is not, ready for prime time. But we need to do those with the just transition lens, looking through the just transition lens, because if our solution is, well, we should all stop driving diesels and petrol cars, and we should all have lovely electric Mercedes and Volvos and Teslas and BMWs and Volkswagens and Renaults. It's all fabulous. But we pillage Papua New Guinea and the DRC and Latin America and Vietnam and so on to get there. Climate change is not the only challenge in this world.
It's a very complex area. But there are a lot of things I will love to pick up from the things that both of you spoke about. But Emily, just to sort of, things you'd like to just react to with what Michael was talking about there.
Yeah, well, let me just, very quickly, because it would be good to get to their questions and answers. But maybe just a brief defense of civil society, and yes, maybe some of the thoughts within civil society sometimes are overly idealistic in terms of what COPs can deliver, but let's give a civil society credit for having had a key role in helping to create the environment in which a greater ambition could be achieved in Glasgow, because there really was, I think, substantial progress between Paris and Glasgow, and a significant part of that was not just because countries suddenly realised that there was, in some instances, as actually Alok Sharma said on Monday, an economic dividend to be reaped from climate action, but actually, also that. Broader public opinion was also moving in a significant way, as exemplified by people actually out on the streets, young people in particular. There are a lot of comments that Michael has been making around energy systems going from X to Y, and the challenges with doing that on a very rapid timescale, and the comments he was, very valid comments he was just making just now about the potential reliance on key minerals, some of which are going to be difficult to source at the scale. This all speaks to the challenge of literally transforming the whole of the global economy on a very accelerated timescale, and that is going to be challenging and messy and difficult, and I don't there's just no getting around that, and you would be definitely naive if you sort of assume that wasn't going to be the case. And of course, the shorter time scale that we've given ourselves in order to be able to do that, then the more bumpy that ride is going to be. And so, a key part of the challenge is going to be, in so many different dimensions, how are we going to navigate that? And there's the practical issues of navigating that, some of which Michael has been articulating, but there's also the geopolitical challenges of navigating that. I mean, just the fact that, many of the, the geopolitical implications of the fact that many of the major corporations in the world currently here today are almost certainly not going to be the ones that are going to be in place, even in a few years' time potentially. And what are the geopolitical implications of that? Many of which involve, shifts of power geographically as well. So there's so many implications. We talk a lot in terms of climate-related risks on the physical side about cascading risks and systemic risk. That's just as true on the geopolitical side as well.
Yeah, and before I come back to Michael to sort of talk more about what the finance sector has been doing, in this space, from your perspective, where would you like to see some of the priorities around, some of the newer policies that are going to actually have to implement the commitments in the NDCs, for example, in the context of looking at some of the immediate emissions reductions that we can try and fast track, which are sort of maybe, I'm not going to call them easy, but maybe slightly easier than others. And sort of what now do we need to be thinking about in order for us to bring in some of the solutions that will deliver the longer term sort of, the longer term reductions that we need? What's your sort of thought on where to prioritize a little bit for those sort of 2030, 2050 goals?
Is that
Emily, sorry, just before I go to Michael to ask him about the finance sector, I was just wondering what you would want to see prioritized, just sort of thinking about where we can actually kind of get, the mitigation agenda really moving.
I mean, a key priority, I think it really is this kind of, which was started in Glasgow, is starting to create action plans, right? So, those countries that have got, net zero targets and some that don't have, any plan as to how to get there, the key priority has to be starting to develop a plan as to how to get there. And that plan, I think this idea of starting to look at individual sectors and then, that enables you to look in innovative ways at those sectors. It is about creating new collaborations across sectors, in order to create this transformation of those sectors. And so that, I think, is the key priority now. It's that, how do you go from ambition to action, and action on the ground in the real economy? Yeah.
And so, Michael, I'd be interested to hear your views on the role that the finance sector is going to play in this, and will we see as much transition and transformation in that sector as we're going to see in some of the others?
If I might, I just want to come back one thing on civic society and one thing on the priorities, what we need to build, actually, in a sense, the engineering, and then I'll talk about the finance. On the civic society, I do agree with Emily that, we are where we are because civic society kind of stamped its foot and said, we expect serious solutions. I only get very concerned when we start to, in a sense, let civic society, which is very uneducated on things like how long it takes to develop a lithium mine, decide and dictate timings on things. And we've got, we've got to that. And I'll come back, when I talk about the finance, I think we're in danger of, adopting unrealistic approaches. That, when I say unrealistic, I don't mean, I don't mean sort of, I know we're in an emergency and all that sort of stuff, but then you've still got to have the time to develop the mine or to develop the supply chain and so on. So I worry about, and I do worry about some of the rhetoric, the talk about, civilizational collapse. And, you get people saying, we've got to go net zero by 2025 in the UK because we're a rich country. Well, guess what? We have no net zero tractors, no distribution system, no refrigeration. So, that is simply, but there's some, let me come back to it when I talk about the finance, because I think to a certain extent, we're living through a mad moment where the finance sector is trying to sort of out Greta in its rhetoric and is actually building itself a trap. In terms of what we need to build, I want to just say one thing. Resilience is the one thing I can't let us kind of get through this and not talk about, because we are going from a system which is largely analog and has got lots of energy stores in it in the form of piles of coal and cars that have got tanks full of petrol and those sorts of things. In fact, we've got oil, strategic stocks of oil and so on. And, the model that I think we're going to end up following is essentially, plus or minus, electrify everything and have clean electricity. And there'll be some exceptions to that around biofuels and so on, but it'll be largely that. The problem with that I see that we're not addressing at all is the problem of resilience. Because, we're going to get to the point where if you have a power cut, it means no police cars, it means no ambulances, it means no heating for old people, it means no food, it means no payment system. We're building, we're enfragilizing, or whatever the word you want to use, we're brittling our entire infrastructure, and we're doing it without a real debate about that. And so, I could talk about how we could do hydrogen for steel, and we could do, this, that, and the other. Those debates are all going on. Your audience is probably involved in some of them, but the fragility discussion is not happening. So I really wanted to say that. In terms of finance, what you've got now is the Glasgow, the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has now migrated in some strange way to the US because Mike Bloomberg, my former boss, is paying for it and co-chairing it, and Mark Carney's gone back to Canada, so they've sort of taken Glasgow with them. Don't ask me how. That is a 130 trillion commitment to be in line with climate goals. There's a couple of caveats. I mean, that's a lot of money. 130 trillion is a lot of money, just in case anybody didn't realize. It's about a third of all the money and all of the finance in the world. There's about 400 trillion of cumulative sort of savings and finance and money out there. So, I mean, it does beg the question, what is the other 2/3 doing? Because we will not win this by having one economy which is investing in clean things and doing and all very virtuous and probably higher cost and very European, and we all feel good about it. But then 2/3 of the world still investing in and doing fossil-based polluting stuff because they need to develop or for whatever, or they don't take climate seriously or whatever. That's not a solution. So before we celebrate GFANZ, we should ask what's happening over there. And then within GFANZ, there's a huge debate about how do you track that and what is that 130 trillion doing? And there's an absolute plethora. There's a kind of Precambrian explosion of different mechanisms. I've counted 60 global organizations trying to push the world to clean finance, and I can't even keep up. It's probably more than that now. And they go across, in their defense, there's sort of 5 to 10 each for insurance and asset management, asset owners, sovereign wealth funds, exchanges, and so on. So there is a ferment of creativity and stuff that's going on there. A lot of it, however, is based on very poor methodologies, just really weak methodological stuff. So Scope 3, I have a particular bugbear. Scope 3 is brilliant for analyzing a value chain, because what it says is if you're involved in selling mobile phones, you might not have the emissions, but somebody else who makes the screens might, or somebody who provides the power for them might, whatever, fine. But when you start as a financial player to add up or to try to calculate your Scope 3s, it is an impossible, not because the data is currently not good, because supply chains are way too complex, they change all the time, and you can't remove the duplications. It is impossible to remove the duplications. So there's a huge architecture of financial consultants, sustainability consultants in finance, helping people to work out the footprint of their portfolio. It is snake oil, right? And it needs to be recognized as such. What is also happening in parallel, though, is that climate liabilities of all sorts are moving from the ESG statements, in other words, from the soft, fluffy bit with a picture of the wind turbine on the cover that, frankly, nobody in serious finance reads. They're moving from that into the financial accounts. If your hotel might end up underwater, you're going to have to take you're either going to have to, protect it, or impair that asset on your balance sheet. And that is going to focus a lot more minds than doing lots of hocus pocus and fake calculations around scope 3s in order to prove the number you first thought of, or whatever. So there is a lot of good stuff going on, along with this kind of complete ferment of frankly, a lot of it is nonsense. And we also have to be very careful on the finance side that that we are not being overly prescriptive, right? And I say, and in the sense that, it's very tempting to say, well, London is going to be the leader in climate finance, so our taxonomy should be tighter, should be more, rigorous than everybody else's taxonomy. Well, it's like, fine, but meanwhile, all of those people out on the streets with Extinction Rebellion have still got gas boilers, right? And they've got old, parents, grandparents. If you can't keep the gas system invested and running because your taxonomy has changed the cost of capital so extremely, and you can't invest in fossil, et cetera, we're going to have much greater social problems. And by the way, push back against climate action than if we, think about it in a slightly more flexible way. So the financial system has become fixated now on 1.5 degrees. The Western financial system, the European financial system, there's that other 2/3 that isn't. And there is a real risk that we simply almost price ourselves out of business and so we end up, as I say, there's the 1/3 of the world that kind of feels virtuous and has driven lots of companies, to Emily's point, out of business, and whose financial institutions can only invest in a small sliver of or a 1/3 sliver of what's out there. But the rest of the world is so far behind and has become detached. And I do very much worry about that. And I think we need to kind of, the caravan needs to, I'm not saying it needs to move at the speed of the slowest camel, but it does need to, move en bloc. And so we need to speed up the slow camels as well as perhaps rein in the ones that are going a little bit too fast.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, I must admit. I'm going to turn to questions because we've got lots, and I'll try my best to get through as many as we can in the time that we still have remaining. But maybe just a first question. You both were quite optimistic about outcomes of COP26, but was there anything that you were a little bit disappointed in, that, and how would we fix that going into COP27 in Egypt? Michael.
I've got one, which is the methane pledge. You also asked, what should we be doing immediately? The answer is methane. Short-lived, really nasty, and we should be doing something about it very quickly. So there was lots of hoo-ha about the 120 countries that signed the 30% reduction in methane. It was also a key part of the US-China agreement. 30% reduction in methane by 2030 is a joke. It is an insult, right? Because this stuff, you can fly a satellite and see where this stuff is coming out of that valve there, and it's pouring out, and we should fix it. And to only be able to fix it by 3-4% per year for 8 years is a joke. We should be shooting for a 30% reduction by 2025 and a 70% reduction by 2030. And we should get serious about methane, and we should get serious about black carbon, soot. And that's something that I was really, I'm perennially annoyed about fossil fuel subsidies, but that's not news.
Emily, how about you?
I don't actually. Well, the one thing we've forgotten to mention, which was a really important aspect of Glasgow, was simply the US being back in terms of the international discussions around climate. And John Kerry was up in Glasgow itself. Never a minute went by whether you didn't see John Kerry walking very fast, looking very, like he was very busy, off to some other meeting. So he was, clearly, plays a really important role. I slightly feel I don't know what Michael feels, but it's gone a bit quiet though. It feels like the obviously, despite them being at the table, is still the domestic situation is challenging for much progress from the US, and that's obviously critically important. In terms of other countries, India, the 2070 pledge from India was welcome, but potentially could have gone further, and certainly the fact that the isn't any intermediate detail yet from India feels like that's important to come forward. Just to pick onto two countries. So, you know, there's no doubt the pledges could have been more significant than they were that came forward in Glasgow. So there's, you know, that is why a critical thing is countries coming forward in a year's time with greater ambition. I think the other thing that I would say, actually, one of the questions when Alok Sharma gave his speech on Monday, he was emphasising the priorities that the UK presidency have for this coming year. And one of the things he was mentioning was the sector-based aspects that were a key part of the UK presidency's pitch. And I asked a question deliberately on that because there's been this, what did they have? They had something on electric vehicles, which was kind of okay. They had the deforestation agreement, which was accused of being a rehash of something that had been done in 2012 or something, was it? And possibly went slightly further, but still could have gone further still. So it felt like each of those, there really was quite a lot more that could have been, to really claim successes on each of those, quite a lot more that could have been done. But also it feels like, well, if that is the sixth, that is the way to start going. There's other key sectors that really could and should be brought into that framework as well. Food and agriculture, for example, major important sectors. So, perhaps there's more that could be done in that direction. And the Glasgow breakthroughs were a key part of what happened in Glasgow as well. But there were so many of those, I sort of slightly lost track as to what was what.
Yeah.
Can I come in on the agriculture piece, because I want to emphasise that. I want to really put a sort of a highlighter on the agriculture piece that Emily's just brought in, because if you look at where we're going to go in the real economy in sector after sector, there's huge and easy advance. Like I say, methane easy, but also transportation's now going. We're kind of getting some line of sight on steel. There's actually interesting things in shipping, cement. Earlier, lots of opportunities for technologies, new chemistries, new approaches in building and so on. But there's going to be residual emissions in lots of those sectors. Right. And clearly aviation, very difficult, because for all that we're excited about, flying taxis, frankly, big airliners flying long distance probably need, a molecule that looks very much like, jet fuel now. And it's going to be very difficult to go totally zero. So we're going to need to do offsets. Right. That was my long way of saying we're going to need offsets. And, offsets, there's only really a few places you can take carbon, and we're actually going to need to take carbon, not just not do it offsets, but taking carbon out of the air offsets. And you can do it through agriculture and forestry, or you can do it through magic engineering, which everybody's very excited about. But when they work out how entirely inefficient it is and how much steel and minerals you need, and they're building these vast things up in Iceland, and BBC's all excited and does these news stories. And you look at the rows and rows of fans, and then at the end of the year, they capture 4,000 tons, not 4 megatons, and certainly not 4 gigatons, 4,000 tons of carbon for these vast installations. So where I'm going with this is we've really got to start doing negative carbon agriculture and forestry as fast as possible, at as large a scale as possible. And I don't think that the agriculture sector realizes either its responsibility or the opportunity. And of course, the policymakers have not started to work out, have not started to say, right, so we're going to have to put gigatons of carbon into probably farming land. Is it biochar? Is it this? Is that? I don't know. What are the policy environments? And we've got a huge challenge. And that, I would agree, we've not scratched the surface. And COP26, barely looked at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving to a different question. This question of, I think there's been a lot of analysis around what feasible solutions might look like to get us to net zero by 2050, and also some interesting pledges. And as you say, maybe not all the money that we need, but certainly a lot of money now kind of on the table going in this direction. But the question is, does the finance sector have the right tools? Do they have the right tools? Do they have the right resources? Do they have the right insights and the right minds to come up with the mechanisms that we need and the financial solutions that we need? And Michael, do you want to take that first?
I mean, it's a really good question. In 2013, I wrote a piece accusing the financial system of being institutionally fossilist, you know, drawing on the kind of terminology of institutional racism, as I'm sure you immediately get. Because even though there were solutions that made sense economically and in terms of, you know, their sort of engineering within the system, the financial system was biased against funding them because of all sorts of things, whether it was your fiduciary responsibilities in pensions, or whether it was the term that you were allowed to invest, because these things need sort of 15-year term, and you can't, you know, there's how you finance them, that things were regarded as technological risks, and therefore were, you know, there were different capital allocations, so on, and it was just the playing field was like this. And where we are now, the playing field is very much flatter, and actually there's a conversation about tilting it the other way. And in terms of whether central banks should start to penalize people who do, you know, who kind of just do the economically best thing for their investors, but it's bad for the climate, and should the central bank be now the one that sort of charges them more of a capital allocation? The problem I have is a little bit is, I think we've reached the point where we may be over asking the finance sector. The finance sector is a service sector. It is fundamentally about financing things in the real economy, opportunities in the real economy. So we've very successfully now demonized, or we're starting to successfully demonize investors who fund things that we don't want, but there aren't yet the things, and the policy environments are not yet there to make money. And this is something that Larry Fink, whom I met during COP26, has written about in his most recent letter to CEOs, that there aren't yet the money-making opportunities on the clean side at the scale required. I mean, he's got a real problem. He's got $10 trillion. I mean, I wish I had a small part of his problem, but to make something make money in transportation, in steel production, in electricity, you know, in energy, you've got to work at the level of the policy in those areas, and possibly a carbon border adjustment to stop, you know, there being leakage, if that's a problem. But, and you know, in a way, there's a sort of laziness to really fix our energy system. We're lagging in the policy in the energy system, and we're lagging in transport, we're lagging in steel, we're lagging in glass, we're lagging in cement. And then we look at the banks and say, well, why aren't you financing this stuff? So they're ready, they've got the money, but they can't throw it at things that just, you know, squander your pension, my pension, and so on. So there is definitely a lag. And what we're currently doing, in a way, as civic society, this is a pass over to you, Emily, that as civic society, we're sending very mixed signals. What we're doing in our activism, we're saying, do this, go to 1.5 degrees, net zero 2050, absolutely, right? In our financial system, we're taking that and saying, well, we'll do the best, and we don't want to be the nasty people, so we'll try. But over here, there's this other thing, and we kind of ignore it. It's really big, but it's in China. It's really difficult to access, and so on. In our behaviors as consumers, we continue to want to go to stag weekends in, you know, in Vilnius or down to Cancun for our American viewers. And so we're sending these very mixed signals. And then as voters, we're ambivalent. We'll vote for people who talk about green stuff, but we won't vote for people who actually, whose actions result in a carbon tax that drives our costs up, or, you know, somebody who actually might, you know, apply the fuel price escalator. They would be voted out, despite the fact that we, you know, 65% of people are concerned about climate, and putting up the costs of, you know, petrol is one way to do that. So we're sending these very mixed signals, and finance is out of kilter with the real economy at the moment in terms of looking for opportunities that aren't yet really there, partly because the technologies and partly because the policy environment has not caught up.
I mean, I think the other challenge, which is one that Michael's alluded to in a number of different ways, and the things that he's already spoken about, is the lack of robustness in the metrics and underlying data to support effective decision making around that, whether that's in terms of, one of the things Michael was highlighting was around sustainable investments, and the fact that there's a 1,000,001 different versions of metrics that rank different organizations in different ways, and to the extent that much of it ends up being effectively meaningless at the moment. Or another area that Michael was just discussing was around offsetting, and robust metrics. It's not just about having the data, but actually how do you intercompare different schemes with different characteristics? If you're talking about agriculture, what metrics are you wanting to be able to use? It's not necessarily particularly straightforward in order to do that, especially if you're wanting to look, as is increasingly the case, beyond just the climate dimension of it. We've got task force on nature-related financial disclosures now coming into the considerations, and so that's relevant to understanding what a good offsetting scheme might be as well. So I think it's about defining those metrics, but then also additionally creating the robust infrastructure to be able to verify any of those metrics as well. So that's a whole extra sort of, layer of complexity to create some sort of robust decision-making framework supporting any innovation in the financial system.
Yeah. Just one thing I might pick up on, and it relates to another question that's here as well, is this issue around, we sort of want our cake and eat it, really, and we're not prepared to take the risks that we need to take. We're not prepared to pay the price, perhaps, as consumers that we need to pay. Ultimately, what's the role of government in all of this in the context of helping to really support? I mean, obviously, yes, decent policies that will help, but are there newer kind of partnerships that would be helpful? And do either of you have any sort of examples, even if they're not even climate related, any examples where there has been an opportunity for the finance sector in particular to work with governments to drive, to de-risk investments or look at kind of how to take a leadership position on a something that might actually be more expensive for consumers at a certain point?
Oh, I mean, there are lots of examples of policy that has driven investment. In fact, why is solar so cheap? Why is wind so cheap? Well, it started with the feed-in tariffs in Germany, and then I would argue, partly because I was pushing very hard for it, but I would argue that the reverse auction systems, which ended up, the contract for difference, but the reverse auctions, so getting price discovery combined with long-term offtakes has driven just revolutionary changes because it scaled and we got the costs down. And there's lots of examples where electric vehicles didn't just happen. There were plenty of there were R&D grants. Then there was capital accelerated depreciation. There were programs. I was on the board of Transport for London, and we funded or co-funded London's first network of chargers. Not very successfully, I should add, but we did. And the learning for that, when I say it was not successful, those charges are not still being used, but the learning from that has gone into all these little startups and all of these companies now doing their thing. There are lots of good examples. I do raise the concern that it's a bit like, we need to turn the pampas into a rainforest, right? The fossil fuel ecosystem needs to turn into a completely different ecosystem. And you can plant some key species. You can say, right, well, we do know that a rainforest is going to have, this sort of tree, and it's going to have these frogs, and you can start doing some introduction, whatever. You probably won't end up with a rainforest. At some point, you've just got to, you've got to do it through, I don't know, water, humidity, more, whatever it is, weather systems, and then let the rainforest happen. Now, there are some introductions of key species, but it's very, very complicated. And I guess another way of saying it, I don't think, political bias coming in here, that we'll be able to centrally plan the transition. We won a huge victory on the ozone layer, the chlorofluorocarbons, but that was like 200 factories worldwide doing most of it, going into a few products where there were alternatives. Actually, I hate to say it, but not that difficult. I mean, even then it was a vast challenge and a triumph to get it done. This is everything. This is every holiday. This is every home. This is every heating system. This is every vehicle. It's every, every industrial process. And centrally planning it, what we actually need to be thinking about is it's about massively distributed innovation in a mutually reinforcing direction. And so when you ask for examples, and I could say, oh yes, feed-in tariff in Germany, the question is it massively, is it massively distributed? Does it also innovate right across how energy is used and how you make sure that there's still heat in a house when there's a power cut, and all the little other species that you need in this system? Are we doing enough on spurring innovation and making it directional? And this goes much more in the direction of Mariana Mazzucato and the mission economy. And she and I sort of agree on the homework question, but enormously disagree on the how, because she wants to sort of centrally plan the innovation, and I just want to work on the temperature and the humidity and the, and so on, and then just, let entrepreneurs, let Elon Musk do his thing.
And some things will fail, and you have to allow a system that allows some things to fail. I mean, this is the major challenge, right? Because you're one, I agree with Michael, right? A complete centrally planned system, it feels like it's doomed to failure here, especially, but the challenge is that we do at least want a centrally planned direction. No. So how can we put in place something that does have some guardrails on it, because there's a clear focus point that we have already centrally planned as to where we're wanting to head. So it's not a complete free-for-all that we're allowing innovation just to do whatever it is. There is a direction that has to be part of this. So how can we put in place structures, incentives, de-risking finance measures are clearly an important part of it, finding ways of unlocking private finance and the significant scale that can achieve, but doing so in a way where you've got that direction, but allowing innovation to flourish in the way that it does, which has to allow failure, but at the same time, it's not just the direction that you've got to plan, but it's also the speed. And so how, and that's a really careful interplay between that failure rate and ensuring that you're achieving that end direction, that end goal on the timescale that is required. And there's some, how you do that.
Yeah.
That's why it's a bumpy road.
But also the speed point is a fascinating one, because I have endless discussions about, renewables can't do the last 10% of this. Fine, I don't know. I'm not one of the zealots who say it can, nor am I a zealot that says it can't. What I am a zealot about is that we need to be doing stuff. If we want to have that discussion, until we get the perfect fusion or fission or renewables with this and renewable, if we want to have the discussion and then plan to the last decimal point what the system will look like in 2050, I mean, did we plan Snapchat in 1980 when we started to deregulate telecoms? No, of course not, right? But there was a sense that by deregulating that we would enable innovation that would provide a much richer set of services. And so I think Emily is exactly spot on. The challenge is how to create that direction and the innovation, but the speed. If we think that if we work back from the speed and say, well, we must be in a certain point by a certain year, we're probably going to paralyze ourselves and go nowhere. So, it's almost like, I think we should go as fast as we can, as fast as we reasonably can, but no faster. And if that's not fast enough, then we're going to have to do more, direct air capture or something at some point. But, if we think that the answer is to destroy capitalism because the maximum speed that the system then reveals is not high enough, and therefore we have to destroy capitalism, we will find that there are examples of this, Holodomor, the Great Leap Forward, when people try to do ideological social change and technological change too fast, really bad things happen. So which I'm against.
I'm going to touch on a different lever, if you like, in all of this, in all this kind of crazy complex system that we've been talking about. And I'm going to pull together two questions. I know we're definitely going to run out of time for all these great questions. I'll try and bring them together. They don't exactly fit perfectly, but there's a question about the resource efficiency agenda, and how far is that going to take us, and should we be really prioritizing that But there's also this question around, you mentioned, the decoupling in a sort of in the economy, but should we be having a more serious conversation about not being so obsessed with growth? And is that kind of something that we need to be a bit more serious about? So I don't know which one of you wants to jump in first with that one.
So I mean, resource efficiency, circular economy, etc. I mean, I think this is we need all of the above kind of answer, I would say. And so, I do think that is important. The growth story, I mean, in a sense, I think we've almost got to a point where I think that, there's a broad understanding that actually that's a definitional term, if nothing else, right? It's about what are we wanting to achieve? And I think there's a lot of thinking going on in Cambridge about beyond GDP. What could we, what is a better, more representative, frankly, measure of what we consider progress to be, and therefore how we should be measuring that. And so what more, what would be a better measure of well-being? And the challenge is, and actually in a way it comes back to some of the earlier comments about metrics in terms of financial systems. The challenge is that you want a trade-off between something that is actually calculable or relatively straightforwardly calculable. Part of the reason that GDP has retained so much traction over the last century and a bit is because it's a single index that can relatively straightforwardly be calculated. So there's I think there is a challenge, but the weaknesses of that system are quite clear.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think that I would caution against throwing out GDP or against being too negative on GDP. And the reason is it correlates really well with jobs because it's a measure of activity in the economy. It correlates very well with jobs. And it's very easy for us technocrats and academics and I don't know what I am, wonks to say, oh, it's terrible. These silly things contribute to GDP, but even those silly things employ people, and jobs correlate very closely with engagement, with inclusion in society for minorities, for women, for disabled. We sniff at it. It's very easy in a period of high employment to pretend that jobs aren't important. They're very important. And you can look at at North Africa and the Arab Spring and so on. These are all conflicts that are driven by the lack of jobs.
But isn't there even something on the jobs thing that I sometimes think that I feel like that we might be at, even on jobs, at a bit of a tipping point. I hate to use that word, but there's something about dignified work and the purpose of work and the purpose of our jobs.
Yeah,
I do feel like there's a slight, we might be at a bit of a change. They're going back almost to a kind of more vocational era in terms of.
So yes and no.
Especially we see that, I feel, in terms of our students in Cambridge.
Right, who are incredibly privileged, right? They do not have in their family a single rag picker from a garbage dump outside Jakarta, right? And so we've just, and surely when we're talking about climate, we are not talking about things that work for. Now, I don't want to be too. I'm not trying to sort of body slam the argument. Of course, there's a discussion about dignified work. I've just been tweeting about the fact that private hire drivers are leaving bottles of urine in the streets around our house, right? That is. I mean, it's a disgusting behavior, but they are also victims being forced to work so hard that they are with no access to proper facility. There's an enormous discussion about dignity of work. But what I wanted to get onto was actually happiness and fulfillment is a lot more to do with the assets that we have access to, not just our financial assets, but also our natural assets, our intellectual, culture, our infrastructure, whether we can jump on a train and go and see our mum or not, and all those sorts of things. And so to me, what I want to see is growth, endless growth in human progress and in human enjoyment of being a human in these tiny little fractions of time that we get on this planet. It's not, GDP is an artifact. GDP pops out of this system. When we transition to net zero, it might drive GDP up because everybody will be frantically building wind turbines and batteries. It might drive GDP down once we've built them all. they just sit there producing electricity at a very low cost. And so GDP made it. I don't care. I actually don't, as long as there are, as long as there's satisfaction. I won't use the word jobs. I yield to you, Emily, there. As long as there's satisfaction, I don't mind GDP goes up or down. But it is, there is this kind of obsessive discussion, particularly amongst, how can I put it? So a lot of young people are like, oh, it's time for degrowth. In other words, that reducing GDP should be a target. And it's a trope that the system is obsessed with growth. The system is not obsessed with growth. It's obsessed with social health, inclusion, right? Things not collapsing. That's what it's obsessed with. And I think there's this enormous, you get people say, oh, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. Well, of course you can, right? Because there's this massive flow of energy from the sun that comes in, right? And we can, Prigozhin, how you can have the endless emergence of complexity, which is all the economy is, in a system that is not isolated from its own. So there's such a load of rubbish being talked in that discussion, and people producing pseudo-academic work on degrowth and failing to stick to the basics. Do people have satisfying lives? Do they feel productive? Are they included? Are we moving away from our planetary boundaries? And so on. All of that is possible within the current economic system if Emily can find a way to put that innovation gradient in. If we can innovate towards the solutions as opposed to just in a random direction, we will all be okay. No pressure.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask you a very difficult question potentially, and I apologize to put you on the spot to have to answer it so quickly. But we started off talking about COP and being quite positive about COP26. Do you feel that kind of global sort of direction of travel and everything that's happened in Paris and Glasgow in particular is going to will kind of weather the storm with any of the geopolitical risks that might get thrown at us over the next sort of 5 to 10 years? I won't kind of expect you to look out too long, but will it stand up to it, do you think, if we had another kind of crisis in one of the major economies? And I'll give you both sort of 30 seconds to answer that question.
It's a fantastic question. Good signs, for instance, that the US and China were able to come up with an agreement in the sidelines of COP, but bad signs, Putin potentially about to invade Ukraine. And I don't know the answer. I will throw in, it might not answer the question, but it's relevant. I had Ban Ki-moon on my podcast, and I asked him whether the diplomatic boycott of the Olympics was appropriate by US, Canada, UK, Australia, and now Denmark. And his response was, climate change is so urgent, we must solve it first before human rights. And I was really shocked at that. I can't tell you how shocked I was, because I think we've got to be able to do both at once. We have to be able to work on geopolitics, human rights, and climate change at the same time. And it's incredibly difficult to do so, but we can't turn away from the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet, etc., any more than we can turn away from those people, those kids in the DRC who are being sent into mines or elsewhere. So we've got to do this all at once. So this is the question, and I don't know the answer as to whether we will succeed or not, but I sincerely hope that we do.
I mean, I think the key difference that, to my mind, between climate and the pandemic, pandemics might have been on global risk registers for a long time, but it was still not possible to predict exactly that we were going to get a pandemic when we did. The thing about the climate crisis is it is utterly predictable in the sense that we know exactly where we're heading if we continue to put greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And so, and it's also predictable, but it's only going to get worse and worse and worse in terms of the impacts if we don't do something about it. So, yes, we might get other, geopolitical shocks that occur in the system across that journey, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't and we can allow our progress to be derailed, because we know all the implications of threat, exacerbators that climate and failure to act on climate gives. But I think the fact that it is, the most predictable global threat in many ways, actually creates an opportunity, because that's a great privilege to be in a place where we actually know that the scale of the threat that we face, and even better, we have many of the solutions that we can deploy, and there are significant, as we've been discussing, significant opportunities that can be reaped from deploying them to create exactly that, that better, more fulfilling future for all of us that we need to find a way of measuring.
Well, look, I'm really pleased to hear both of you being so optimistic about this, because, in terms of your knowledge of kind of how to tackle this, I think it's really, really inspiring just to hear that positivity about, being able to get there. So I want to just thank you both so much for joining us today. Really, really fascinating conversation. And thank you all for those who have joined us to listen in. Really appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Great honor and pleasure.